December 21, 1945. Washington, D.C. was quiet in a way it hadn't been for years. The war was over. The telephones that once screamed with emergencies now rang less often. Maps were being taken off walls. Decisions were no longer measured in minutes and lives. For the first time since 1941, Dwight D. Eisenhower was no longer carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Then the phone rang. The message was brief, clinical, almost casual in its delivery. George S. Patton was dead. For several seconds after the call ended, Eisenhower did not move. Those closest to him later said he didn't speak either. He simply sat there, staring at nothing, as if something essential had just been removed from the room. For 3 years, Eisenhower had lived inside a contradiction. Publicly, he had disciplined George Patton, restrained him, apologized for him, and in some cases, quietly sidelined him. Privately, he had depended on Patton in moments when the entire Allied war effort stood on the edge of collapse. Eisenhower had defended Patton to presidents, soothed foreign allies furious at his behavior, and repeatedly put his own reputation on the line to keep Patton in uniform. Now, Patton was gone. And for the first time since the war began, Eisenhower didn't have to protect anyone. He didn't have to measure his words. He didn't have to balance politics against battlefield necessity. What Eisenhower allowed himself to say after that phone call would reveal a truth he had buried for years. Patton was not just a great general. He was irreplaceable. That truth had been too dangerous to acknowledge during the war. But without Patton alive, without the consequences of saying it out loud, Eisenhower finally allowed the mask to slip. To understand why that admission mattered, you have to go back to the beginning. Long before Normandy, long before Sicily, long before the Battle of the Bulge, back to a dusty American training camp where 2 young officers first recognized something rare in each other. Camp Meade, 1919. The First World War had just ended, and the U.S. Army was shrinking back into obscurity. Budgets were being cut. Careers were stagnating. Most officers were content to wait out their time and hope for promotion. Eisenhower and Patton were not those men. They were captains in the newly formed Tank Corps, an experimental branch that many senior officers openly mocked. Horses, not engines, were still considered the future of warfare by much of the Army's leadership. Eisenhower and Patton spent hours together in garages and motor pools, tearing down engines, sketching battlefield diagrams, arguing about speed, shock, and maneuver. They believed the next war would not be won by trenches or static defenses, but by movement, fast, relentless, overwhelming movement. In many ways, they could not have been more different. Patton came from old wealth. He carried himself like a knight out of another century. He believed deeply in destiny, in glory, in the idea that some men were born to fight wars. He had already seen combat and wore his confidence like armor. Eisenhower was a farm boy from Kansas. He had missed combat in World War I and carried that disappointment quietly. He was analytical, careful with his words, keenly aware of how fragile a military career could be. But together, they saw something no one else wanted to acknowledge. Modern war would reward speed over caution. The Army did not appreciate their enthusiasm. Their ideas were dismissed as reckless. At one point, Eisenhower was warned directly that continuing to push tank warfare concepts could damage his career. Patton didn't care. He had money and connections. Eisenhower did. That difference mattered. Patton learned to speak louder. Eisenhower learned to think further ahead. By the time the next war came, those 2 captains had become something else entirely. Eisenhower was supreme Allied commander in Europe. Patton was the most feared American general the enemy had ever faced. Their friendship endured, but now it existed inside a hierarchy filled with pressure, politics, and consequences. Eisenhower no longer debated Patton as an equal. He managed him, and Patton hated being managed. Patton believed Eisenhower had changed, that he had become cautious, political, overly concerned with coalitions and appearances. Patton wanted decisive action. Eisenhower had to think about Roosevelt, Churchill, the British command, the Soviets, and the post-war world that would follow victory. The tension between them was constant, sometimes quiet, sometimes explosive. Then came Sicily, August 1943. Patton, commanding the 7th Army, visited field hospitals and encountered soldiers suffering from what was then called battle fatigue. Men who could no longer fight. Men who had reached their psychological limit. Patton saw weakness where others saw injury. In 2 separate incidents, he slapped soldiers, berated them, threatened them. Word spread quickly. Journalists caught wind of it. Politicians demanded accountability. The American public reacted with outrage. Eisenhower faced a decision that would define the rest of the war. He could remove Patton and satisfy everyone who wanted his head, or he could keep him and absorb the political damage himself. Eisenhower chose neither extreme. He issued a formal reprimand. He forced Patton to apologize publicly. He made sure the punishment was visible enough to calm critics, but not fatal to Patton's career. Why? Because Eisenhower was already thinking about France, about an invasion that would decide the fate of Europe. And he knew something no press release could ever say. He didn't just want Patton for that invasion. He needed him. Privately, Eisenhower admitted something even more uncomfortable. While he did not excuse Patton's actions, he understood the mindset behind them. War demanded endurance. Armies broke when discipline collapsed. Patton's instincts were brutal, but they were not entirely wrong. Eisenhower carried that contradiction silently. He reprimanded Patton in public and protected him in private. That pattern would define their relationship for the rest of the war. As preparations for the invasion of France accelerated, Eisenhower confronted another problem. The Germans were expecting an Allied landing. But where? The solution was deception on a scale never attempted before. And once again, Eisenhower reached for his most dangerous weapon, not Patton's tanks, not his divisions, but his reputation. The Germans believed Patton was the Allies' best commander. They tracked his movements obsessively. They feared his speed, his aggression, his unpredictability. So Eisenhower used that fear. Patton was placed in command of an army that didn't exist. Fake units, fake radio traffic, fake equipment. Patton toured bases, gave speeches, allowed himself to be seen, while the real invasion force assembled elsewhere. The Germans took the bait, and Patton, sidelined and furious, believed he was being humiliated. Eisenhower never told him the full truth, that his presence alone was saving lives, that his name was shaping the battlefield before a single shot was fired. That sometimes the most powerful use of a weapon is not to fire it, but to let the enemy fear it. Patton would only learn the full scope of that decision much later. By then, everything between them had already changed, and the war was about to demand Patton in the only way it ever truly had. When chaos arrived, August 1st, 1944, George Patton was finally released. For weeks after the Normandy landings, Patton had been caged, watching others fight while he paced headquarters floors like a coiled spring. He had played his role in deception. He had been the phantom threat that froze German divisions in place. He had swallowed the humiliation because he had been ordered to. Now Eisenhower gave the command Patton had been waiting for. The Third Army was activated. What followed stunned everyone, including Eisenhower. Patton did not advance. He exploded. Within days, the German front in western France collapsed into confusion. Patton's armor poured through gaps faster than German commanders could comprehend. Entire enemy units were bypassed, surrounded, and annihilated before they understood what had happened. Roads clogged with abandoned equipment. Command posts were overrun before orders could be issued. The Germans were no longer reacting to Allied plans. They were reacting to Patton's momentum. Eisenhower watched reports come in with disbelief. This was exactly what they had talked about back in 1919. Speed not as a tactic, but as a weapon. movement so rapid it shattered the enemy's ability to think. But the same qualities that made Patton unstoppable also made him dangerous. Patton was moving so fast, he was outrunning his supply lines. Fuel became the limiting factor of victory. Ammunition lagged behind tanks. Infantry units struggled to keep pace. Coordination with neighboring Allied armies began to fray. Patton didn't care. He saw Germany cracking. He believed the war could be ended in weeks if he was simply allowed to keep moving. "Give me the fuel," he demanded, "and I'll be in Berlin." Eisenhower understood the temptation. Privately, he admitted Patton had a point. The German army in the West was disintegrating. Every pause allowed them to regroup. Every delay was a gift to the enemy. But Eisenhower was no longer just a general. He was the commander of an alliance. British forces needed supplies. Political agreements with the Soviets dictated occupation zones. Montgomery demanded resources for his own operations. Eisenhower had to think beyond battlefield brilliance and toward post-war stability. So he did the thing Patton feared most. He said no. Supplies were diverted. Patton was slowed. Priority was given to Operation Market Garden, a bold airborne plan that promised a quick end to the war without relying on Patton's relentless drive. It failed, spectacularly. Patton was furious. He believed Eisenhower had squandered the best opportunity to end the war early, that politics had overridden military logic, that caution had replaced decisiveness. Their relationship deteriorated into something brittle and strained. The trust forged in engine bays decades earlier was still there, but buried under frustration, resentment, and the unbearable pressure of command. Then came December 16th, 1944. The Germans struck back. In the Ardennes forest, under cover of snow and fog, German forces launched a massive counteroffensive. American lines collapsed. Units were surrounded. Communication broke down. Panic spread. For the first time since Normandy, defeat seemed possible. Eisenhower convened his commanders in an emergency meeting. The mood was grim. Maps showed a bulge tearing into Allied lines. Suggestions centered on containment, delay, defense. Eisenhower listened. Then he turned to Patton. "George," he asked, "how soon can you attack?" The room went silent. Patton's Third Army was engaged to the south, oriented entirely in the wrong direction. To respond, he would need to disengage, pivot 90 degrees, reorganize under winter conditions, and attack through snow into the teeth of the German advance. Most commanders would need weeks. Patton reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small notebook. He had anticipated this moment. He had run the numbers, planned the routes, imagined the chaos. While others reacted, Patton had prepared. December 22nd, he said. 3 divisions, 72 hours. Some in the room thought he was delusional. Eisenhower did not. He had known Patton too long. "Make it happen," Eisenhower said. And Patton did. In brutal winter conditions, the Third Army pivoted with impossible speed. Convoys moved day and night. Orders were issued faster than they could be written. Officers improvised. Units trusted momentum over perfection. On December 22nd, exactly as promised, Patton's forces slammed into the German southern flank. The effect was immediate. The German offensive stalled. Momentum died. What had threatened to become a strategic disaster turned into a grinding German retreat. The Battle of the Bulge was broken. In that moment, Eisenhower knew the truth with absolute clarity. Everything he had endured managing Patton, every scandal, every apology, every political headache, had been worth it. Because when the war reached its most dangerous point, when the alliance hesitated, when the rules no longer applied, Patton delivered what no one else could. Afterward, Eisenhower's public statements remained careful. He praised teamwork. He emphasized cooperation. He avoided elevating Patton above other commanders. But privately, something shifted. In planning sessions, Eisenhower began asking a question that unsettled his staff. What would Patton do? Not because Patton was always right, but because Patton saw the battlefield differently. Where others saw obstacles, he saw openings. Where others calculated risk, he calculated speed. Where others hesitated, he acted. Eisenhower relied on that mindset, while knowing it could never be allowed to dominate the alliance. It was a contradiction he carried alone. The war ended soon after, and almost immediately, Patton became a problem again. His public comments were reckless. His views on post-war Germany clashed violently with political reality. His desire to confront the Soviets was unacceptable. The man built for chaos had no place in peace. Eisenhower made the hardest decision of his career. He removed Patton from command. The friendship did not survive it. Patton felt betrayed. Eisenhower felt trapped by necessity. Then came the accident. And 12 days later, the call that ended everything. Only after Patton was gone did Eisenhower allow himself to speak freely, and what he said would redefine how history understood both men.